Hello and welcome back to the Near Futures podcast, in which I look at the developments likely to affect our lives both at work and personally in, you can guess from the title, the near future. This is Guy Clapperton. This time we'll be continuing the conversation with Ash Gawthorp, Chief Academy Officer and founder of 1010, which recruits and trains people with the right skills for today's environment. But first, a word from my sponsor. Well, all right, it's just me plugging my media training service. Or your clients want to sound as confident, clear and fluent in media interviews as the people in this podcast? Of course you do. My team and I can help. Drop my assistant Lindsay, that's lindsay@clapperton.co.uk, a note and she'll set us a time for an initial chat. Or go to the website at clapperton.co.uk, 2 Ps, to find out more. Now, back to the podcast. Now, last time, and if you haven't listened to it, I urge you to, we covered the speed of development of AI, how difficult it can be to ensure that people keep up with the rate of change. We looked at the risk of learning skills that become redundant too quickly, and quite a lot else. Ash, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Guy. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Great stuff. Look, last time we spoke about learning and how making errors can actually help. Let's pick it up from there. How open do businesses have to be as a culture to employees making errors during their learning journey?
They have to be very open to it. And speaking with experience of our customers that we work with, they are. They need to recognize that employees learn through making mistakes and that some things will fail. And that it's only when you undertake projects and work where you know you're not going to be successful necessarily, that you will really push the boundaries of what you understand. If you only undertake projects that you know are going to succeed, where's the innovation in that? I think the phrase, aim for the stars and you might get to the moon, absolutely rings true there. But most importantly, they have to have the guardrails in place. You have to have the governance and oversight around it to ensure that while these mistakes are being made on their learning journey, that they're being made in a safe place, in a safe environment. And that works both for protecting the business, but also at the same time for, protecting the individual, frankly, and not having them afraid to try things and afraid to innovate.
That makes a lot of sense. But how can an employer mitigate this? Because if it's a large company, they could lose a fortune. If it was, say, Thames Water, I don't fancy being without water for 2 days while they sort out an IT glitch. How can employers mitigate allowing errors to happen?
It's all about defining the scope of where the learning will be, what the individual will be doing, and putting those guardrails around it. And in fact, just like any project or anything that's new, you need to run it in the right way. If it's something you haven't done before, you need to start small. You start small on an application that isn't critical. If it's, as you said there in that Thames Water example, you do not want to be leaving people without water in terms of supporting somebody on their learning journey. And you don't even want the ability, regardless of how badly things went when that person was learning, where they could be in a position where they could be able to influence any of those outcomes in that kind of way. And if you do start small and you don't bet the farm on it, then if that small project piece of work works, or in fact, even if it doesn't work, but you learn from it and you discover another approach that you think might work, that is a success. And you've won the right to move on to something slightly larger in scope. As a secondary but very, very important benefit, as you do this, we're not working as islands, we're not independent, we have people and teams around us, and what we do is visible. As you do this, you also win hearts and minds of the people around you who buy into what you're doing and see the value of it. And that's so much easier when it then comes to you saying, okay, now we want to take this to the next level and we want to do something else. Put all that in place and you won't lose a fortune. In fact, the government recognises this. When you look at the R&D tax credit system, where you have projects which are demonstrating true innovation, you're able to reduce your costs of investing in that as a business through favourable tax mechanisms. And it doesn't need to succeed. In actual fact, HMRC recognise that the need for innovation means that a lot of these things will fail. And in fact, that's almost encouraged.
And I should just stress that when I said Thames Water, that, in case their lawyers are listening, that was a purely random and entirely fictional example. I'm not suggesting they're going to do any IT failures in the near future or distant future. I'm going to stop saying Thames Water now because I might get in trouble. But down to the individual, there can be a lot of pressure on people to perform when it comes to developing things. Have you seen a lot of burnout, and what can people do to mitigate that risk?
Yeah, I think you need to keep a close eye on individuals and how they are progressing, because we often see people who put a lot of pressure on themselves and they become frustrated with how long the learning journey is taking. And they also are frustrated at the fact that they can't undertake and demonstrate those kind of learning outcomes that they will get to at the end. That is just the way that it works. Learning new skills in tech is exactly the same as learning any skill. So learning to ski, for example, or learning to play an instrument. To be able to become accomplished at that, you have to learn how to snowplow initially. You have to practice scales. You have to play simple pieces before you can play the complex ones. In fact, I recall the first company I worked for straight out of university, a company called 3D Labs. They made 3D graphics processors back in the day, actually, when NVIDIA was just a startup. And the CEO was a chap called Osman Kent, a lovely man. And he had this phrase, "The journey is the reward." And 21-year-old me didn't really get that. And it took a long time to work out what he meant by this. But he was 100% correct. It's about a journey. It's about going on that journey, and it's about setting aside time to be able to take that journey, essentially. And the end of that journey, you might not be where you wanted to be. You might get to the end of that journey and find out it's not what you wanted to do. Those are all valuable lessons. As an aside, actually, Osman was quite the visionary. I recall him talking 30 years ago now around the 3D graphics processors that we were producing back then, and how he felt they could do much more than graphics. 30 years later, here we are with NVIDIA, traditionally a sort of graphics accelerator through silicon provider, as the world's largest vendor of silicon for AI. So, he was ahead of his time. But I think you mitigate that risk by not having people put too much pressure on themselves. You need them to get them to recognize that this does take time, not to lose faith, not to become frustrated, and just keep at it. Like anything in life, if it's worth doing something, it will be hard. It's about setting time aside to stick to it and do it. And that's critical. Anyone can do the learning when they have the time and when there's no other pressures. But the mark of whether you'll succeed or not, in my experience, is what happens when it is hard to schedule that time, when there's a lot of other pressures around and you don't find yourself having time to learn, or when you're struggling to learn something. This is where the discipline and the resilience comes in to see it through, you to be able to stick at it. But that said, if you do have a wobble and you're not able to continue and you have to pick it up, take a break, but most importantly, pick it up again. And I think a final point on that, it's also back to that point of safety and having people learn in a safe environment, and not aligning it to something critical, not aligning it to something where you say, well, you need to learn these skills now because in 3 months we're going live with this product, and the future of the business depends upon this product. So you need to build those skills and then you need to implement it. That puts pressure on people. When all's said and done, you want to make learning as fun as it can be.
Okay, so how do you keep people keen to keep learning? And also, I'd like to combine this with another question close to my heart. The typical view of the developer or IT professional is of a young, thrusting professional. Now, my generation's already done its thrusting, very much thanks. That sounds wrong. But I'm clinging on to my 50s with my fingernails. It's not going to last. Can you be too old to keep up, do you think?
No, I firmly believe not. From my experience of our tech academy and the hundreds and hundreds of people that we've put through this in the last coming up for 12 years since we've run it, we've seen people from 18 through to people over 50 engaging with this program and working in it with no prior experience of tech before joining us. And age is just a number. And I think traditionally there's older workers, they do tend to be impacted a little bit more by ageism. We're seeing these sort of age-based stereotypes sometimes impact workers across the generational spectrum. So in the UK, only 1/5 of tech workers are over 50. So that's 1/5 of tech workers over 50 working. But despite the fact that the age group represents 33% of the total population. And I see this on LinkedIn, for example, where there are experienced professionals who are regularly sharing their struggles in securing new roles. And actually, this isn't just a UK thing either. Looking in the US, we're seeing sort of age discrimination charges nearly 20% up in tech companies compared to other industries. And the US tech workforce does skew notably towards younger people, with the 41% of workers in 25 to 39, compared with just 33% in the overall workforce. And I think most concerning, workers over 40 have seen a steady decline in tech industry representation. So that's highlighting a troubling trend of age-based exclusion, and also I think people leaving the industry as well.
So it obviously affects both ends, so that's perfectly fair enough. Thinking about the learning process, how do we keep learning benchmarks real and realistically? Is it possible to push back for employees to push back against unrealistic goals and objectives?
Yes, I think it has to be, and I think this is a really, really important point. If that person is undertaking some learning, upskilling, and it's a project to be managed just like anything else. You can see how far through it you are. You can see the velocity you're actually getting through it. And if you find that you are struggling with some content more than others and not progressing it at the rate that you should do, then that's something to flag up and something to make people who are responsible for the timelines of learning and where you're going to get to aware of that. And that's really, really important, because if you don't push back on those unrealistic goals and objectives, then you are going to fail. And again, that comes back to that pressure point. If you are trying to learn in that pressured environment, I know that works for some people, but it doesn't work for everyone. And you need to be very, very, very wary of that. And I think the important point is that you put those benchmarks together and you test them, and you make it back to the point we were making last time around those learning journeys and building those. It's important that you cover not only the content of what will be learned and the different tests and the different practical experiments and the assignments and everything else, but also how long you expect people to be able to get through that. And when you're putting that together for the first time, there has to be a recognition that those timescales need to be honed over time as you put more and more people through it. If you've had 100 people through that process and you start to see some outliers in terms of how long it's taking somebody to get through it, then maybe that's something that needs to be investigated further. Maybe they're not getting the time to spend on it. Maybe that's not the training for them. Maybe that's not the right style of training for them. But those milestones and how long it will take you to achieve them, they need to be revisited. They need to be tested by putting people through that and refined over time.
Okay, we started last week's episode with a mention of Meta's war room activity to counter the emergence of DeepSeek. Meta has resources. What can smaller companies do to adjust to these seismic changes? That's if you agree it's seismic. Don't let me put words into your mouth when and if they crop up.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right, Guy, in terms of it being seismic. I think we mentioned last time that, frankly, DeepSeek came along and they caught the large US tech firms napping. They were expecting probably a good few years run rate of being able to just get increased revenue through scale of doing what they were doing, but with more parameters, larger data sets. And DeepSeek came along and managed to do that with far, far less resources at a price point which is less. And on the one hand, it's seismic, but in terms of smaller companies, I think this is actually a good thing for them. Essentially, small companies aren't producing these large models. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the deep pockets to be able to do it in terms of the renting the infrastructure or in terms of powering it. I think it was last time when we said that the power to train these latest LLMs, for example, it's the equivalent power of being able to run 100,000 US homes for a year. It's monumental. But what happens in practice is that these smaller firms who are actually using AI, they are implementing their solutions using these models. And there's a lot of consumer choice. When you go to a cloud provider like AWS with Bedrock, you're able to choose and plug in the different language models. And they have a different price point according to which ones you're using and what you're doing with them. So being able to line this up alongside those. Now, I'm quite sure AWS will probably come under some pressure in terms of bringing in DeepSeek's model and what that might look like. But nonetheless, this is only good for consumers, that you have the choice and the ability to choose a cheaper model if that is fit for your purpose. But again, at the same time, DeepSeek are a relatively big firm by comparisons to many organizations, because organizations aren't building their own models. They're leveraging existing ones for their own needs and their own workloads. And I think at different levels, this works for individuals who are consuming these tools to be more productive in their daily lives. I use these myself to be able to summarize my notes, to be able to track documents that I create, to be able to question these documents for things that I've written in the past, to be able to have them sort of refine and give me answers back on previous things I've written. That's game changing, and that saves a huge amount of time. And I think those things are just going to be compounded over time as new tools come along. Quite what that means for my memory in terms of me being able to, or having to recall this stuff myself rather than the machine acting as my second brain and doing this for me. Maybe we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But for the time being, there are huge benefits to both individuals and smaller companies being able to do this and leverage AI.
You're making complete sense, and you've very generously engaged with all of my questions without pushing any sort of commercial agenda. So can you tell us a bit about what 1010 does, what you're working on at the moment, and of course, where listeners can find out more?
Yeah, sure. So 1010 is a tech consultancy, and we've been running since 2007. And over the last 12 years, we recognize the challenges, a lot of what we've addressed today in terms of bringing people into the workplace against a backdrop of ever-evolving and ever-changing skills in terms of what's required. And so we built our tech academy coming up for 12 years ago now to be able to do this, to be able to bring people into the organization, to be able to train them in the latest tools, the latest skills, the latest technology, but bring them in as well-rounded individuals with the right soft skills to be able to collaborate, to be able to influence, to be able to get on with a wide variety of different people at different times and communicate in the right way. And doing all that without individuals having necessarily what you might consider to be a traditional tech background of that traditional tech degree, but training them in what they need to know in order to be able to do the role within tech. And as well as providing consultancy services, a big part of 1010 has been able to provide our 1010 Academy, Tech Academy graduates to customers, so they have the option but not the obligation to hire them further down the line and then become their own permanent employees. A lot of what we're focusing on now, not surprisingly, is sort of targeted around AI and machine learning. And from our point of view, this really sort of goes into sort of three different levels. There's the base level of that, which I strongly believe everybody in the population should have, which is all around the idea that AI and machine learning is not magic, it's just maths, and not necessarily be able to understand how it works, but to be able to understand what it can do and the limitations of it. The second layer is really all about us taking individuals and embedding AI into their work so they are able to be more effective, leveraging the existing tools, but also able to trial new tools. And we touched on this earlier around building small and building that capacity in a low risk way, and then testing them out and then building on that. And then at that sort of top tier, we have individuals who are working at the sharp end of machine learning. So this is around building models, training those models, deploying those models, testing those models in the real world. So a real kind of combination of different individuals with different capabilities. But I would say it's kind of pervasive through the business, really. And in my mind, although AI has been around for, it's sort of Alan Turing was first sort of talking about this sort of towards the end of the Second World War, and others alongside him in terms of what the future of computing should look like. With the ability now for us to be able to spin up infrastructure from the likes of AWS, has sort of facilitated this to be able to be used by everyone, and I think it is going to be, to use your word, seismic there in terms of its impact and what it can do. But ultimately, at its heart, you're still going to need good people who can get on with other people and who can implement this technology in a safe and sound way. But yeah, if you want to find out more, www.1010.com. And or get in touch with me on LinkedIn.
And that's spelled TEN figure 1010.com. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah, correct. Yeah.
That's great. Ash Gawthorp, co-founder and Chief Academy Officer for 1010. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Guy. It's been a pleasure.
And as always, thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more like this, please do subscribe to the Near Futurist podcast on any of the platforms available, and check the website at nearfuturist.net, where you can find information on me speaking at your event or emceeing it, and of course, if you scroll down, more episodes of this podcast. Do come back next week for the first installment of our next interview. Thank you very much indeed. See you then.